They were talking about a movie night with a conspiracy theme at SIS. One of the tech guys suggested 6 Days of the Condor, but it was put down as unrealistic that a job like that could go unnoticed by the police in the middle of New York City.
No comment.
Anyway, Moneypenny suggested Blowout.
I don't like the way De Palma copies stuff. I'm not into it. Blow Up is a classic, and it's a much more nuanced critique of reality.
It's not my favorite either, but I was just thinking about Body Double. Did you see it?
Yeah, schlocky. Hitchcock with porno in Southern California.
I think it's better than Hitchcock in some scenes. It's more alive than the museum piece, which Vertigo is becoming.
Hitchcock is getting dated. His thing is suspense at the expense of logic.
Exacto! That's why I like the whole Body Double remake. It takes Hitchcock to the end, takes it out of the museum and pumps it full of illogic. It's better.
Hey, James.
Yeah, Felix.
You know what a woman without an asshole is?
What?
Single.
Oh.
Bond said with a crooked smile and half shaking his head laughing.
Felix, did you hear that fucked up joke about the Palestinian prostitute and cunnilingus?
Yeah, the Gaza Strip thing. Terrible.
Felix took 14th Street to Massachusetts Avenue and headed in the direction of Tudor Place.
Been doing any travel reading, James?
Bond was glancing at the surface of his red iPhone 16, which was the phone of his character, Mr. Black. It was linked into Google Fi and seemed to get pretty good reception mostly.
What, Felix?
Travel reading?
I'm dipping into Mutti's autobiography.
The double life of a former commie sprung on democracy.
Yeah?
James, get this. The Wi-Fi's better on the moon, closer to a free contact with the satellites.
We already live on Mars. The way we live on our devices. Elon Musk wants people on Mars so they can keep living on X.
Hey, James, they have a robot comedian that interacts with the audience with facial recognition and writes its own jokes.
Are they funny?
The bot says, I went out with an Apple device. It didn't work, unfortunately. I couldn't get a word in. It was always I this, I that, and I the other.
Bond smirked and let some air out of his nose.
The AI actually wrote that?
Yeah.
This device belongs to Boris Black. I don't usually like to flash the latest rubbish.
Bond said almost seriously, and he tucked it away in his jacket pocket.
No, the fanboy geek gene missed you, brother.
Bond didn't mind the trophy wife or two somewhere vested in the little pricey houses, a few midday drinkers swilling brandy in the corners and shadows quite unseen behind the handsome facades. Workmen fixing goodness knows what in a conspicuous way about a street corner, a frail-looking old person taking a walk, empty chairs on the patio of an unfrequented bog-standard restaurant, a homeless person smelling like urine. It wasn't all this that concerned Bond, but the mission. As they passed through a lovely neighborhood into a little bustle of businesses, Felix was making some turns according to what his machine read. Bond, glancing at the patio of a little Mexican restaurant, asked Felix if he had a gun for him.
Try the glove, James.
They rolled past some gas pumps into a fine old niche of well-kept, quiet two-story houses. The lights suffusing the neighborhood blinded Bond for a second. Bond discovered a Glock 17 with a modified trigger.
Thanks, old buddy.
Bond said as he checked the 17-round magazine. The indicator showed a bullet already in the chamber. There was another magazine, but he left it. 18 shots seemed about all he would need. Bond slipped it in his empty belt holster. Felix spun into a tiny lane with a few shops that blended into the residences. One of them had a sign that read used and rare books. You have to have a gun to shoot, just as an agent is overcome by ennui without a mission. They had to go down to the end of the block and turn to find a free space to park his black AMG S63 Mercedes in front of a tree. Bond noticed a recurring graffiti tag. It read, Ret Bran in block letters. It was carved into the tree crudely.
Look.
Felix looked at it.
Internet talk, some kind of far-right wing for kid bloggers slogan.
Where's this Susan Swindleborn? Odd name, isn't it?
She's right there.
A woman approaching 50, rather smartly dressed. Hair dyed black, curls about the shoulders, well preserved, stood in front of the bookshop across the street and half a block down. The information said she was a volunteer book dealer, the profits for a university. She was a professor at Bryn Mawr College who had a doctorate in East Asian Studies from Princeton. Bond's best subject at Cambridge had been East Asian languages. After the greetings and Felix having shown his credentials, Mrs. Swindleborn started in. Mrs. Swindleborn, the way it went down was that the big man, he was standing right here, gestured, snapped, and the one guy grabbed him, had his arms around him in a bear hug, and the other man pried his mouth open, and while he was biting him, he ripped his tongue out with his hand. It's amazing. I didn't know a tongue could just be ripped off like that. Bartleby was spitting blood out, and they knocked him to the curb. That was really his name, Bartleby Burns. She was getting visibly flustered.
It's awful.
Felix said.
And Mr. Burns was a volunteer at the shop too? Mrs. Swindleborn? Yes, just like me. I was watching through the window, right there.
And she pointed.
The big man, he was too big to get into the shop, even if he had tried by the looks of the front door. Mrs. Swindleborn. He never tried to come into the shop. He was just talking to an old man with a cane. Rather fat old man. Well, not fat exactly, you know. Girthy, nicely dressed, looked an amiable sort, really, somehow.
She seemed self-possessed, but somehow very upset at the same time. Mrs. Swindleborn? That's him, she said, and pointed across the street, a few paces down the block, to a man in a blue blazer with a great white beard and a rather large carved wooden cane, which seemed to have totem animals or something depicted on its entirety. Bond unholstered his weapon as he asked.
The man the big man was talking to, that's him? Mrs. Swindleborn? Yes.
Swindleborn answered without any delay. Bond darted ahead of Felix across the street in a manfully directive trot.
Here for a rendezvous,
Bond said in a clear voice which carried 10 feet ahead of his gait to the old bearded man. A roguish grin showed under the white of his beard. He made himself harmless. His cane wasn't a weapon, but the accoutrement of an itinerant raconteur. Bond wasn't yet sure what to think. What variation of criminal was this? In a swift second, Bond sized up a second man behind the tree.
For a wake?
The old man said, likely ready to add that it was for Bond and that the accompanying dirge would be a thing of beauty. But Bond saw the second man raising a heckler assault weapon. A gunman with basiled eyes, 6 foot, extremely solid, sinewy build, slender. He looked like the will behind his muscle was absolute. Maybe a Serb, about 35. Bond thought he would have to use the gun and not his gentle art, jiu-jitsu. Bond fell to his left knee with his right leg stretched out and then flicked himself right behind a big blue Volkswagen sedan. The loud sound of the shots which missed him were interrupted by the rapid pop of Felix's Glock 19 blasting its bullets. The old man rushed Felix and fell on him as Felix got a shot in his neck. The man dropped his cane and simply bear-hugged Felix with a nasty look of cruel frenzy on his face. Felix fell hard on the concrete under the fat of the elderly man. Bond stretched his gun tight with 2 hands over his left shoulder and with one shot pierced the old man's pate. Felix hefted the body over and saw the shooter half a block off running tight between the trees. Everything sunk into an abyss of black behind the bulging eyes of the great girthy Whitebeard. Bond turned and went at a sprint after the shooter. Felix looked over to see what had become of Miss Swindleborn as he took out his phone and called home to report.
Sorry, just a job, narrator. While Felix was playing with his partner under the table in the low light of the nightclub, Bond drew towards the heat of the bedroom with his match for the night. He couldn't get a shot, but the man must be going for a vehicle, or did he have backup? Bond decided to bet he was going for a car and moved heedless in the open at full tilt. A big black boot struck Bond laid in from a man who must have been in a tree. The Serb spun around back. Just as Bond was getting up, the assault rifle took aim, and Bond took a left-handed shot and twice tapped him in the heart. He had a thin vest on. He fell over and lay dazed. Bond glanced at the man who had come from the tree and who stood weaponless but menacing. Bond took a shot into the Serb's head. The man, paid as a lookout, put his hands up.
Bond saw a blue SUV up the block pulling out of sight. It was the only thing moving further into the rural area west of him where Susan and Felix had been. Some kind of noisy chattering, like a dozen children when their parents have come to pick them up, sounded further off to the east, while silence held in the other directions. As it approached, it sounded out as police sirens. It was still a ways off, and the approach to the quiet lane, which was the spot the crime had taken place, took a bit of maneuvering to reach.
Damn economy is murder, S2. So many things a man does for $1, you wouldn't believe it, sir. Murder, but sir, you're not really even hurt. Narrator. Bond drawled out the word. The evening glow of the action with its comic effects of lights, which would interpret the legal meaning of the disturbance to public and private, flashed at the edge of visibility. Bond never took the gun off the man who had injured him from above. He wasn't sure if the injuries were really serious. It didn't actually hurt so much, except when he tried to move his neck and shoulder. In a crooked posture, he tossed the cuffs over to the man. It's Dar al-Harb S2 attempted murder. Now sit down, narrator, the man said, as though to the universe. The man dutifully put on the cuffs with his hands in front. What the hell happened to Felix, narrator? Bond ordered. The man sat down cross-legged and looked somehow rather nice, almost like a plump Khan of Persia, reclining in contemplation of the landscape.
Bond muttered, turning about bodily under the mildly intolerable pain in his neck and shoulder, which movement triggered in his animal spirits. The whibble-wibble boop-boop of the ambulance and the kind of rolling coaster siren of the police cruisers was just entering the limit of the possibility of human ears to hear. It seemed Felix had been carried away in the SUV Bond saw pulling away. A moment like an island was rushing towards the shore of the hole. Bond had to go before this little hour was invaded. The moment of the kill had a special place in his memory now. Secreted off from humanity and all its customs, an ideal moment when survival was the only happiness. Like a piece of old food discounted on the shell of social existence, in a moment the police would spoil it, would speed time, and it would become toxic and run full of acids of rot. But if he could get out for the rest of his life, he would be visited occasionally by its purity and be blessed. What exactly had happened with the professor he couldn't make sense of. Bond called into Q branch, was answered immediately, and downloaded the smart key simulator for Felix's Mercedes. While he was on the phone, Q interrupted the man assisting Bond to tell him they'd sent a device to him at the Four Seasons.
Don't rubbish the mints.
Fine, Q. Thank you. Pleasure. Goodbye.
Bond pulled out slowly as the police cars rolled in to where the man was sitting cuffed on the sidewalk several blocks from where Felix had parked. Bond rolled slowly down the quaint little blocks of Wisconsin Ave, taking many stops. An empty shop window advertised by the realtors read, "Realize anything." A man with a puffy jacket was eating something on a stick and carrying a bag slung over his shoulder. The outbreak of automatic weapons fire and the subsequent police passing by and the wave of ambulance blaring which followed had evidently made no impression on the area. Bond hung a left and was at the Four Seasons in 10 minutes. The valet called in to the concierge, and the concierge, a man of about 60, girthy, with a pink tie and a blue blazer, caught sight of Bond as he came in through the lobby and approached him with a warm.
Hello, Mr. Black.
He had a box of After Eight mints in his hand, and when Bond took them, Bond then went on to ask,
Could you possibly have a vodka martini sent up to my suite?
Bond was visibly dishevelled, and there was blood on his shirt.
Shaken, sir?
Shook, but not broken. Thank you very much.
The concierge nodded as Bond marched off to the elevator and to his capital suite. Bloody M, Bond thought. Can't keep a damn thing secret. Bond reflected with disgust that his nickname for Griffith White, 8, must be making the rounds all through the gossip mill at SIS. Bond drank his martini, glanced through the package delivered from Senator Adams, and passed out on the bed and dreamed he asked Felix about Kosovo.
James, it's like the bar scene in Star Wars.
Bond saw a neo-Rausch-like selection of aliens gathered about a mountain which was a den of a bar.
There's Trumpian aspects, our guys, your top friends, and regular American army, Kosovo guys, bunch of NATO guys, Wanax group, organ dealers, big organ trade, darknet stockroom. They ship things all over.
Bond woke, showered, and spun about and over the Theodore Roosevelt Bridge and up the Potomac along the GW Pequea to the George Bush Center for Intelligence, where he had a contact.